All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on what feels like a winter day, though I know it's still autumn. But it's good to see everybody. I'm Brad Wilson. I'm with the James Madison program here at Princeton University. Today we have a lecture in our series, America's Founding and Future. Today our speaker is our Reno, Rusty Reno, on the Society of Love and Its Enemies. Rusty serves as the editor of First Things magazine. He taught theology and ethics at Creighton in Omaha for 20 years before going to First Things. He's published in many academic journals. His opinion essays appear in lots of different venues. His most recent books include Resurrecting the Idea of a Christian Society, I think just last year, and Fighting the Noonday Devil, which is a collection of Rusty's essays, Sanctified Vision, and a commentary on the book of Genesis. He got his PhD in theology from Yale University. We won't hold that against him. Rusty, please. Thank you.
It's great to be here, and it's great to be a guest of the Madison program. This is the American Founding and American Future series, but I'm here to tell you that today we're just doing the future side of things. And if there's an element of founding, and I will be speaking historically, it's the founding of what I'm going to call in this talk the post-war consensus. So there is a retrospective and a prospective dimension. The title of the lecture, I think, is The Society of Love and Its Enemies. And I realized after I gave Brad that title that I should have been more precise and titled it The Love Society and Its Enemies, echoing Karl Popper's book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And that's going to figure prominently in my talk today. Well, I recently picked up a copy of the Financial Times. And there was a time 10 or so years ago when I was a regular subscriber. And I found the editorial pages of the Financial Times useful. I regarded the newspaper as a reliable voice of neoliberal realism. It's less wonkish in tone than what one finds in the highbrow American press, and less ideologically predictable. But as I read that through the paper last month when I happened to have had one, I was reminded about why I never think to pick it up anymore. As is the case with many conservative magazines, the regular writers whom I once read with interest now seem irrelevant. Edward Luce, who's the Financial Times columnist who writes about the United States, writes about Donald Trump with all the bluster of the New Yorker, as if just one more column pointing out that Trump is ignorant, corrupt, and evil will finally exorcise him from public life. Martin Wolf, who's the ultra-establishment economic columnist for the Financial Times, interprets the populism of the last 2 or 3 years as an epidemic of what he calls derangement. Like so many others, he seems not so much to be engaging the present as waiting for the nightmare to end and for reality to return. Even at this late date, nearly 2 years on, Philip Stevens, another Financial Times writer, credits Trump's electoral victory to his ability to arouse ugly passions in, quote, a base of angry, often elderly white men, end quote. It's a view often stated by the New York Times columnists, with the exception of the elderly slur. Perhaps I'm being unfair. Maybe the Financial Times and other mainstream organs are less exhausted than I suggest here. But of this I am certain. The mentality that I've outlined is widespread. It's one of horror and disbelief rather than analysis and reflection. It is as if there can be no political debate about the ways in which globalization has dramatically transformed the national economies of the West. Nor, it seems, can this mentality imagine that we must make a fundamental decision about whether or not to trust the utopian promises made by multicultural ideologies. The promise, for instance, that diversity will be our strength, or that breaking down walls will, in fact, promote harmony. It's telling as well that this mentality is not limited to neoliberal newspapers or liberal pundits. Jonah Goldberg, for example, can't see populism as anything other than an irrational spasm, the reptilian expression of the tribal mind that refuses to accept the end of history miracle, which turns out miraculously to be the late-date Reaganism he has been peddling throughout his career. My purpose this afternoon is to unpack this anti-populist mentality, which I submit as widespread. My argument will be that it reflects a calcified form of the consensus that emerged after World War II. This consensus, what I'm going to call tonight the post-war consensus. It's funny, I have to stop here, that I knew I was aging when in the final years of teaching at Creighton University in the late aughts, I had to clarify to students that post-war meant post-World War II. But that itself is a sign that the post-war era is ending. And that this consensus emphasizes motifs of openness, spontaneity, creativity, and innovation. It was formulated in order to prevent the return of what I call the strong gods of the West, which is to say, the passions and loyalties that were thought to be the sources of fascism, nationalist-inspired wars, and totalitarianism. And this post-war consensus, I'll argue, explains why notions such as open trade or open borders, and even this broad notion of open minds resonates so positively in our time. These notions enjoy the moral prestige of anti-fascism. It also explains why dissent from this consensus is shamed rather than analyzed and assessed. Failures to affirm openness are treated as tacit endorsements of gulags and concentration camps. Now, after making a historical argument in the first half of the paper, maybe let's call it 2/3, I'll shift to a political argument. I'll make the further case that the post-war consensus has become dysfunctional. It prevents us from addressing the challenges of the 21st century, which in the West revolve around a lack of solidarity and shared loves rather than the dangers of an over-consolidated national project, or too rigid borders, or young minds closed upon dogmatic truths. So that's the roadmap for this afternoon. So to the historical thesis. Even as World War II raged, the philosopher of science Karl Popper worked to complete The Open Society and Its Enemies, a 2-volume diagnosis of the civilizational madness that led to global conflict. By Popper's reckoning, civilization faces a choice. We can live in a tribal or, as he calls it, closed society, characterized by deference to authority and the subordination of the interests of the individual to the needs of the whole, or we can break free from this collectivist impulse. The term collectivist or collectivism he uses quite frequently, this collectivist impulse, and build what he calls an open society, one that, quote, sets free the critical powers of man, end quote. And by his reckoning, the future of the West depends upon choosing the latter, and that's the gravamen of Open Society and Its Enemies, the book. Now, the imperative that's operating throughout the 2 volumes of Open Society and Its Enemies is bracingly simple. And the imperative is never again. Never again shall we permit totalitarian governments to emerge. Never again shall we allow societies to gather themselves into a fever pitch of ideological fanaticism. In service of this imperative, we must banish the strong gods that preside over closed societies and create an open society organized around the free individual. Now, I'm using strong gods. It's a metaphor or image. I will define it towards the end of the paper. So I know some folks they bristle when I use this kind of language, but I promise to define the term towards the end. Now, one of the strong gods, the nations of the West, one of the strong gods that the nations of the West must overcome is the nation, or the concept of the nation itself. We're tempted to imagine that our collective lives is in some sense sacred, giving the community a rightful claim upon our loyalty. Now, Popper regards this as he calls magical thinking. It's a form of, quote, anti-humanitarian propaganda, end quote. By his reckoning, the individual is the only sacred reality. And good governance means allowing, he uses the term, institutional technologists. He's a great early proponent of the technocracy. He wants institutional technologists to develop and refine the machinery of the state so that it serves the interests of everyone in even-handed and impartial ways. Now, Popper knows that there will always be what he calls state worshippers and other proponents of collectivism, but they must be dealt with firmly, he insists. Anyone who relishes his homeland and its history is, and this is his term, a racialist. And according to Popper, and this anticipates today's rhetoric of anti-racism. But why would someone become a state worshiper, especially after witnessing the disastrous consequences of National Socialism? In The Open Society and Its Enemies, Popper proposes a psychological explanation that has been widely adopted. Popper hypothesizes that we feel a, quote, strain when we live in a society governed by democracy and individualism. The collectivist proponent of a closed society therefore promises something easier, a warmer, more comforting existence. Social authority, like paternal authority, is attractive, Popper argues, to those who are insecure and fearful. Intimidated by the personal responsibility that freedom brings, we long for the security of obedience. We desire an escape from freedom, as the social psychologist Erich Fromm put it in the title of his influential explanation of the origins of Nazism, published in 1941. The closed and tribal society is psychologically, this way of thinking insists, it's psychologically soothing and reassuring. It helps us avoid the tension of, and this is Popper's language, an ever-widening field of personal decisions with its problems and responsibilities, end quote. Against this temptation, we must gird our loins, Popper warns. We need to embrace our freedom with courage rather than deferring to authority out of cowardice. Only an open society can save us from the return of totalitarianism. Now, the main body of Open Society and Its Enemies is devoted to an attack on the metaphysical tradition of the West, embodied in the person of Plato. Popper sees any form of transcendence as implicitly totalitarian. To claim that there is something higher than the individual sets up a supra-personal authority. Long before the invention of words such as logocentrism or heteronormativity, Popper cast strong truth claims as threats to freedom and as midwives to the rebirth of totalitarianism. So, he argues, we need modesty with respect to truth if we're to develop an open society. It specifically commends nominalism as the proper philosophy or the proper epistemology and metaphysical outlook for an open society, nominalism. Now, although his framework is different, Popper anticipates John Rawls, whose political philosophy became influential towards the end of the 20th century. Rawls extends the liberal tradition of keeping theological claims at arm's length from politics by arguing that we should not govern society in accord with metaphysical notions of any sort, or comprehensive doctrines in his terminology. This differs from Popper, who rejects metaphysical claims because they are not open to empirical falsification. But the overall stance is largely the same. According to Popper, the strong truths are strong gods. As a consequence, they pose a threat to liberal norms. They're enemies of the open society. We need public reason, as Rawls would put it. This means an anti-metaphysical and often procedural approach in which truth claims are limited to what can be empirically assessed by those who have command of the relevant data. In Popper's terms, we don't need politics in the classical sense at all, for that involves arguments about how we should live, arguments that invariably outrun the domain of what can be subjected to social scientific analysis. Rather, our politics needs to go small, as it were. It should be scientific and not metaphysical. This is a quote, "A social technology is needed whose results can be tested by social engineering," end quote. In this respect, Popper anticipates the reduction of public life to wonkish debate about how to allocate utilities. Now, this politics of the open society seems to beg an important question. What is freedom for? Historically, the West has appealed to metaphysics and religion for answers. And Popper is aware of this question, and he gives an existentialist answer of the sort Albert Camus would make popular in the early 1950s. We must accept this strain of freedom, courageously embracing the existential tension that comes from knowing that we must decide for ourselves the ends our freedom are to serve. It is up to us to define the truths that we need to make our lives worth living. As Popper emphasizes, and this is in italics in his text, quote, "Although history has no meaning, we can give it meaning," end quote. The very truth about reality itself depends upon us. Quote, "Facts as such have no meaning. They gain it only through our decisions," end quote. Now, Nietzsche thought it would take superhuman strength for someone to self-consciously give himself his own truth. Only a strong God, the Übermensch, can mint truths rather than discern and obey them. This is certainly not what Popper wants. His object is modesty and not assertion. He therefore hedges, and throughout Open Society and Its Enemy uses the term meaning rather than truth when it comes to these existential questions about how to live. And this move characterizes the post-war era, which consistently adopts a deflationary policy when it comes to truth rather than a strictly relativistic approach. Following Max Weber, Popper insists that value-free facts alone constitute the domain of truth. Whatever we make of them amounts to meaning. In this way, Popper weakens the strong God of truth, keeping it narrowly scientific. When we need a guiding and commanding language with which to govern our lives and set standards for society, we appeal not to truth, but to meaning. And this is, I think, one of the characteristic weakening moves in the post-war era. Now, like so much else in the Open Society and Its Enemies, the shift from truth to meaning is required by the Manichaean political choice that the years between 1914 and 1945 seemed to press upon the West, either an open society or the horrors of Auschwitz. In the face of such a choice, the search for transcendence becomes a dangerous endeavor rather than reflecting a healthy human desire. By Popper's account, we are tempted to to elevate truths and pledge our trust to them, setting us on the road back to totalitarianism. The only way out of this trap is to adopt the double pattern of weakening, and that double pattern is to go small with value-free, fact-based truth, and to satisfy the larger needs of the human heart with an ambiguous rhetoric of meaning. So you go small with fact-based empirical truth, and then insofar as people need to have something big, something larger, you satisfy that with an ambiguous rhetoric of meaning. And those are both the ways in which we weaken the strong God of truth. Now, the 2 volumes of The Open Society and Its Enemies that I have at home are a first edition, published in Great Britain in 1945, as American soldiers were liberating the Buchenwald concentration camp and Berlin was in ruins. The signature in the front shows that it was bought by James B. Conant, then president of Harvard University and one of the top civilian leaders of the Manhattan Project that produced the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. His discreet markings in the margins indicate that he read the book with interest, especially the parts where Popper expounds his conviction that, quote, an attitude of reasonableness, end quote, must serve as the basis of a democratic society. Now, Conant was no moral relativist, and nor was Popper. They trusted in science and believed in the intellectual virtues of impartiality, honest debate, and close attention to empirical data. Although the Axis powers had been overcome, the future of the West remained uncertain in their minds. And they were not alone. The Soviet Union's aggressive stance in the immediate aftermath of the war dramatized the totalitarian temptation. Concerns about the dangers of a closed society were widespread among the leaders of the democracies in the post-war West. Their counsel was vigilance. The virtues of an open society must be championed. They believed the West needed a thoroughgoing cultural reconstruction to forestall the return of the strong gods. And so, whether directly inspired by Popper or not, the establishment American liberalism of the sort Conant represented moved in the direction of empiricism combined with meaning-oriented rhetoric that had inevitably punted when it came to metaphysical foundations. As George Marsden explains in his account of the post-war politics in the United States, wonderful book, The Twilight of American Liberalism, 1950s and the Crisis of Liberal Belief, as he recounts, the older consensus about natural rights gave way to a liberal consensus about the importance of consensus. And I should submit here that meaning lends itself to establishment-dominated politics, because meaning is much more socially dependent than truth. So belief in a new post-ideological way of life was widespread after World War II. Social scientists and psychologists such as Abraham Maslow, Karen Horney, Rollo May, and others may not have read Popper. Nevertheless, the idea was in the air, and they developed his themes. They were concerned about the closed society of bourgeois sensibilities, which was thought to be too constricting. The middle-class milieu of the 1950s was glossed as conventionality, the psychosocial analog to Popper's closed society. This was deemed an impediment to personal growth and authenticity. To counter these consolidating closed society pressures, influential psychologists of the era articulated therapeutic versions of the open society. At the same time, the new pop psychology of personal growth and self-realization remained scrupulously anti-metaphysical, again following Popper. Not explicitly perhaps, but certainly as part of the larger and increasingly powerful post-war consensus. A therapeutic search for meaning supplanted the classical search for truth. This search was framed with platitudes, all playing on the theme of openness in one key or another. We're to grow towards greater meaning, toward self-actualization, or toward autonomy, or toward, quote, a fuller and more expressive way of being, as Hillary Clinton put it in her convention speech as a graduating senior at Wellesley at the end of the 1960s. Now, at first glance, it seems obvious that a politics without principles and growth without determinate ends must be, by definition, be open and capacious, for there would be no basis on which to exclude any particular ideas or initiatives. That's the idea of the open society. And of course, post-war liberals complimented themselves for having exactly those qualities. And some indeed manifested Popper's hoped-for openness. But in the main, the consensus liberalism since 1945 has punished dissent. It consistently berated strong truth claims as signaling a return of illiberalism, fascism, or other evils of the pre-1945 situation. And it's a mode of argument still very much with us today. I don't have time to go into it, but if you look at the reviews of William F. Buckley's God and Man at Yale, it is really shocking how the reviewers evoke the specter of Nazism and fascism. One of them even intimates that Buckley's book harkens the coming of the Ku Klux Klan. And then Walter Lippmann in 1955 wrote, I think, Print Toward a Public Philosophy or something like that. And it was a book, it was kind of pop McIntyre before McIntyre, and a recognition that there needed to be determinate ends for public life and so on and so forth. And again, in 1955, the reviewers, they smelled what was, they could smell the strong God of truth in Lippmann, and he also was denounced as crypto-fascist. Founder of the New Republic, kind of icon of liberal journalism for decades before. So it's very interesting. Now, this should not surprise us, this heightened rhetoric of anti-fascism. As Popper makes clear, pragmatism in politics, as to say the end of strong truth claims in public life, produces paradoxically strong political and cultural imperatives. And Nietzsche recognized this, which is why he said it would require heroic will to power to give ourselves our own truths, and not liberal tolerance. The open society requires denying principled political arguments and policies, at least if they're principled in any kind of metaphysical sense. Championing authenticity in personal life requires rejecting the authority of traditional moral norms. You can't get young people to embrace anti-authoritarianism without deconstructing authority. Thus, as the post-war emphasis gained strength, it imposed what I call a negative piety, teaching us that we have a duty to the future of society and to the well-being of our children. We have a duty to banish the traditionalists, for they are loyal to the strong gods, which are the underlying cause of fascism. As the students rioting in Paris in 1968 insisted, it is forbidden to forbid. And far from being revolutionaries, they had learned their lessons well after 1945. Now, as Popper was working on Open Society and Its Enemies, Friedrich Hayek was writing his own wartime book, The Road to Serfdom. It, too, sought to guide the reconstruction of Europe after the defeat of fascism. Published in the same year as Open Society and Its Enemies, 1945, Hayek's analysis has a different feel. As an economist, Hayek's focus is narrower. During the war, England's economy, and for that matter, the United States as well, was transformed into a command and control system of production quotas, rationing, price controls, and wage boards. Hayek was horrified to learn that many intellectual leaders in England envisioned the continuing of these methods of economic planning once the war had ended, redirecting them towards peacetime objectives. He wrote The Road to Serfdom to warn against the dire totalitarian consequences of this course of action. Now, Hayek, very similar to Popper, frames the future in terms of a choice between individualism and collectivism. The collectivist imagines society governed by powerful forces that weld individuals into a single we. This pattern of thinking about social and political life, argues Hayek, characterized Hitler's race-based fascism, as well as communism's class-based totalitarianism. Hayek is not as precise as Popper, but he intuits that resisting collectivism requires adopting an anti-metaphysical stance. The basic principle of individualism is individual liberty, which means we must resist anything that compels our choices, including solid and significant moral truths. The essence of individualism is the freedom every individual enjoys to be, quote, the ultimate judge of his ends, end quote. I must have the liberty, in other words, to decide what is good or bad for me. Now, Hayek, I think, he equivocates in The Road to Serfdom between what's good and bad for me in a narrow sense having to do with my economic interests, but he equivocates between now what's good and bad for me ultimately. In short, Hayek, like Popper, treats metaphysical realities, including the social bond, moral truth, and perhaps even God himself, as threats to the individual. And Hayek, too, advocates a severe intellectual asceticism. Only the individual is real, he insists. Notions such as the general interest or the common good are at best placeholder terms for aggregations of individual interests and welfare. Politics should be concerned about maximizing individual freedom and utility, not promoting a common way of life or sustaining a moral community. This really comes out in Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. He's very explicit, where he denounces John Kennedy's "Ask not what I can do for my country, ask not what my country can do for me, but what I can do for my country." Although both Popper and Hayek champion the individual against the collective, they certainly don't agree across the board any more than center-left and center-right expressions of the post-war consensus have agreed in social policies over the last 70 years. Popper speaks warmly of these social technologists who adopt an empirical approach to governance. Hayek, by contrast, offers a thoroughgoing criticism of the technocratic approach. Against rational planning, he champions, quote, the spontaneous forces of society, end quote, and this is paradigmatically the free market, which is why he became a hero of the post-war conservative movement in the United States. The bulk of the road to serfdom argues for the free market and against socialism. Our political goal, Hayek insists, should be to expand the range of individual freedom, which means that we should seek to bring as much of civic life as possible under the dominion of spontaneous, market-organized relations. The more the market rules, the safer we will be from totalitarian domination. For in Hayek's theory, the market mechanism is intrinsically anti-totalitarian. Now, so the two kind of interesting founding figures, Popper and Hayek, often thought to be kind of the left, right, although they actually, Popper, he became estranged from Hayek, but in the immediate aftermath of the war, he was one of the original founders of the Mont Pelerin Society. Popper joined with Hayek in founding that society. Well, more towards the present. As the post-war era reaches senescence, the main thrusts we find in Popper and Hayek have become ascendant. The post-war center-left is the home of the cultural project of openness. It's got the anti-metaphysical stance, transgressions that break down authority of social norms and thus promoting inclusion, and the politics of diversity and multiculturalism. This explains why post-war establishment, post-war liberals could so easily absorb the seemingly revolutionary challenges of 1968 and their outworkings over the last few decades. It does not take that much effort to fit them into Karl Popper's framework. By his way of thinking, explosions of traditional norms become expressions of anti-fascism. And I would submit that today transgenderism enjoys moral prestige for the same reason. It's anti-fascist, intrinsically anti-fascist. So one could say that the center-left in the post-war era has become the party of cultural deregulation. Meanwhile, the center-right has been the home to the promise of the free market as the source of social order that does not rely on normative authorities, other than those necessary to maintain stable market mechanisms. The European center-right laid the foundations for the open markets that evolved into the European Union. American and European center-right parties promoted global economic liberalization after the fall of the Soviet Union. Although terms such as individualism and collectivism that motor the analysis in The Road to Serfdom have fallen by the wayside over the decades, the basic thrust of Hayek's approach animates the right-leaning post-war consensus to this day. Freedom, peace, and prosperity, by this way of thinking, are best served by expanding the market's function as the foundational source of social order, peace through trade. So we could say then that the center-right is today the party of economic deregulation. And more these parties have merged. And today we see the deregulatory spirit predominating, both in cultural and in economic life. It goes under the name of neoliberalism, and it is most clearly evident in the bipartisan default to the position of open borders. I think immigration is where the kind of cultural deregulation and the economic deregulation sort of most clearly merge together. So sort of Bret Stephens on the one hand, and then, you know, I don't know who the right sort of left version of that would be. But it seems to me that we can't continue down this path, because we face a crisis in the West, and it's depicted in different ways. Some treat it as an illusion, a consequence of momentary derangements. There's a bit of that in the Financial Times analysis. Others warn that economic changes over the last few decades have broken the social contract between labor and capital that was established after World War II. And Thomas Piketty, I think, best representative of that argument. So others point to unrestricted immigration as the source of populism. I think Chris Caldwell, A Reflection on the Revolution in Europe, or Douglas Murray, The Strange Death of Europe, I think that's their argument. And finally, some identify a spiritual malaise, one rooted in secularization and manifest in the very low birth rates in Europe, reflecting a mentality that desires no future beyond the worldly self. I suppose you would call First Things the representative of that mode of analysis. In fairness, I think there's something to be said for all of these explanations, even the one that treats the crisis as illusory. For it is my conviction that our troubles stem from the superannuated post-war consensus, and not perhaps a crisis of realities on the ground. The imperative of openness rather than solidarity, and the preference for spontaneous order rather than authoritative order, has led to an anti-politics that deprives us of the concepts we need to face the challenges in the West in this 21st century. And here's a kind of off-the-cuff list of those challenges. Should there be limits to globalization, and if so, set by whom and toward what end? Related, can we make the global economy work for middling folks in the West? Other, are we able to restore a shared moral community that protects the weak, not just from the strong, abortion being a paradigmatic case, but from their own tendencies towards self-destructive behavior? What is the future of the Pax Americana? How should we respond to mass immigration? Can we repair the broken trust between the establishment few and the demotic many? I think it's kind of the implication of Charles Murray's coming apart. In sum, I think you could say that kind of a red thread that runs through all those challenges is the question, what is the role of the nation in the 21st century? However we parse these questions, I think that they require us to ask much deeper questions than we have been trained to ask by the post-war consensus. The questions touch on the essence of public life. Who are we? What is the common love that we share? What communal loyalties properly demand sacrifice? Who among us belongs to the we, the collective we? Popper and Hayek rule out these questions. In an open society, they must not be asked, much less answered, for they lead to fascism, or so we are told. I mean, thus we see in our own time the prevalence of the kind of reductio ad Hitlerum that I wrote a review of Jonah Goldberg's book, and I was so proud of him. He got halfway through his response before mentioning Hitler. For the free market libertarian, the miracle of spontaneous order means that we need not ask or answer the question of the we. Free trade will knit the world together. Something like Paul Samuelson's theory of the price factor equalization shows that the market will eventually sort out the disequilibria brought by globalization, or so we're told. If we're just patient, the market will solve our political problems, which means we don't really need politics at all. As Popper and Hayek understood, in every political culture, the we touches upon sacred things. We are by nature social animals, but the particular we is a gift. Patrimony comes unbidden. I was not created a Reno. I mean, in the sense I was created as a human being, but not from a particular family. The same holds for the solidarity we feel as distinct peoples. We are not created American or English or Polish. And of course, this is true for the religious we as well, which comes from a divine source. These forms of solidarity are communities of love. They are love societies. And they are political then in the most fundamental sense. They require intentional effort to guide and sustain. Put differently, they don't just happen, but rather they require decisions. Communities of love call for us to exercise our freedom under the virtue of prudence, which is a fancy way of saying that they must be governed. This is true for something as small as the domestic society united by the bond of marriage, as it is for a polity as gargantuan as our own, United States, united by patriotic piety. And the same is true of the supernatural society, the church, which is precisely a source of crisis in the contemporary Catholic Church, is a crisis of governance in that society. The agony of the West in the 21st century rests in a crisis of the we. At every turn, we find solidarity in marriage, nation, and faith increasingly inaccessible. These forms of the we are disintegrating. At the same time, we've inherited, so I would say there is a crisis on the ground, decline of marriage, decline of civic life, and a decline of religious communities. But at the same time, we're experiencing this decline, we have inherited a political cultural consensus that describes even efforts to articulate what we have lost as crypto-fascist, to say nothing of efforts to renew these forms of solidarity. You try to talk about the crisis of the family at Princeton in certain fora, and that is, even to describe it as a crisis is to adopt a kind of fascist rhetoric, authoritarian rhetoric, patriarchal rhetoric, et cetera. I'm not part of the academy anymore. I can't come up with these terms quite as rapidly as I used to be able to. And it goes across the board, center right and center left. The ideology of the open society has become the enemy of the societies of love. Now, my definition of the strong gods. The strong gods are whatever evoke love. Love of the divine, love of truth, love of country, love of family. The post-war consensus is fearful of love, which it rightly recognizes can sometimes lead to very destructive devotions. Our consensus in favor of openness seeks to prevent these dangers by depriving us of love's objects, which means banishing the strong gods of all sorts. It does so by critiquing, deconstructing, and deflating them. It has succeeded for the most part, and in doing so, it has brought calm to the West. But the post-war project of peace without love cannot go on much longer. Man was not created to be alone, as we learn in the second chapter of Genesis. We do not desire calm, even when satiated by countless pleasures. We yearn to join ourselves to others, not just in matrimony, but in social and religious bonds as well. The we arises out of love. It's a ferocious power that seeks to rest in something greater, to rest in loyalty to strong gods worthy of love's devotion and sacrifice. I am more and more convinced that our political upheavals reflect a crisis of the post-war consensus and its fixation on preventing the return of the strong gods. It is not a crisis of modernity, it's not a crisis of liberal democracy, it's not a crisis of capitalism, and so on and so forth. This consensus, which is fairly recent, 1945, and the elite devoted to it, deprive our fellow citizens of objects worthy of their love. We suffer from an unrestrained, unleavened liberalism, the part of our tradition that drains dangerous passions and commanding loves from public life. I think it's a healthy element of our tradition, it's a good element of our tradition, has become all-powerful, even to the point of condemning love's loyalties as fascist, racist, or in some other way, a source of oppression. Now, insofar as our present leaders insist upon the post-war consensus, they will bring woe, not peace. This is my conviction now as 2018 draws to a close. For absent opportunities for love, for true and ennobling loves, of which patriotic ardor is surely one, people will default to demagogues and charlatans who offer them false and debasing loves. Our job, therefore, I charge us all, is to restore political life by developing a language of love, a vision of the we that befits our dignity and appeals to our reason as well as to our hearts. We need to become patrons of the humane strong gods, the ones who come from above and animate the very best of our traditions. For I submit in closing that only that kind of leadership will forestall the return of the dark gods who rise up from below. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rusty. Well, Rusty's put a lot on the table for discussion, so we have a good deal of time here for that. Let me invite any students in the audience to ask the first questions.
Ageism.
Students of any age. Okay, then we'll open it up for general discussion. Just put your hand up. I'll call. Yes, Teresa.
I was curious about the antinomy between the open society and the society of love, in part because the language of love is precisely the rhetoric of the open society, like loving the unknown other, loving the immigrant, loving the poor, loving whomever one chooses. is kind of what you hear so much of today. So I'm wondering, what is the distinction between that kind of love and the kind that you believe characterizes the society of love that you talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that you can love the world or love humanity in the same way that you can love something that's particular. And so there's a big difference between a rhetoric of love that has no real object versus a rhetoric of love that is ordered towards a living person, living community, living tradition, living history, or living God.
Nathan, Mikoski.
Yes, thank you. So I have two questions, one historical and the second a more philosophical point, starting from that more philosophical question. So the first is I'm thinking of the use of the post-war use of the term of end of ideology or of consensus, which critics were quick to point out presupposed a certain understanding that was itself quite controversial in the time. We could go around, say, Western countries and point out exactly where it was controversial. So I'm wondering if using that term, in fact, grants too much to the other side in the debate. It effectively makes an ideological perspective come before that drops out other kinds of views or other kinds of political possibilities that existed within the 50s and 60s. So that brings my second point.
Well, okay, so what do you think were the options that existed in the 50s and 60s?
Well, let me just focus on one generally. So I'm thinking of Christian democracy and that idea.
Right.
So we could look at that in terms of political practice. Maybe if we wanted to discuss it in terms of an intellectual thinker, we could posit someone like Jacques Maritain to discuss. So
I think Jacques Maritain is trying to find a way to, I think he agrees with Popper, but he doesn't want to go all the way, obviously, and so he wants to be able to, I mean, so for him it's pluralism rather than open society, as he uses it, but he wants to, pluralism is a softening and weakening, it's a weakening move. And if you read The Peasant from Guérin, you know, he's obviously horrified by the trajectory that the church has gone on, which seems to, if you will, kind of weaken its very dogmatic essence. But if you look at his chapter on social issues, he really equivocates. He thinks we live in a state of emergency where we have to affirm a kind of pluralism that's unsustainable theoretically, because he wants to affirm that the lordship of Christ is universal and it's not negotiable. But at the same time, he says that given the nuclear threat and all that kind of stuff, we have to affirm a kind of pluralistic setting. So I think he's not a counterexample, but is actually part of the story.
okay, interesting.
And John Paul II, I would also put him as part of the story. I think that I've come to see that the church before 1945 emphasized the authority of marriage, paternal authority, and patriarchal authority, and also the authority of the church as checks on both the dominion of the market and also the authoritarian state. And then John Paul II, the part of his brilliance is an attempt to salvage, if you will, those authorities by regrounding them in the gift. And so it's not the authority of church, really, at the end of the day, that limits the totalitarian state. It's man's search for meaning. And in Fides et Ratio, he uses the word meaning a lot. And so that's not, anyway, I don't want to, it's just, I'm impressed by the depth of this consensus, which struck me as that I too believed it. I mean, I'm 58 years old, and I read Open Society and Sanity for the first time in grad school, and it resonated. Love is dangerous. It closes upon the beloved. Love is strong as death, as the Song of Songs says. And it rouses people to do to do amazing things, but also very horrible things. And so you were going to. It makes sense that the responsible establishment in the West had moderate and extreme versions of the sort of open society notion.
Okay.
Your second question.
Yes,
Okay.
a quick follow-up then changed on what you just said, because it seemed like you were pointing at something like Christian democracy. I was curious what your thoughts were on that, but I think you just answered it. So then the question is, what kinds of political forms or political philosophical traditions should we be looking for to think about these ideas? Where would you start going to look for that?
Yeah, boy, now you've gotten to the part of the book I haven't written yet. And this is drawing from a larger project that I'm working on. Yeah, I mean, I think you know, the metaphysical traditions of the West strikes me. I mean, Plato, you know. But what does that mean in terms of? If you read Open Society and Its Enemies, it is not a political philosophy. It is a book of rhetoric. And you know, years ago, I remember reading Russell Kirk in grad school and throwing the book against the wall, thinking, it's just rhetoric. There's no theory there. And I've come, as I gotten older, realized that theory's overrated. And that, so someone like Kirk is important, useful to go back to. Because he is definitely conservatism of piety rather than a conservatism of a kind of limitless freedom. But that's probably not satisfying you, is it?
Don't we need a conception of the best regime? Sorry to keep cut me off, whatever. But don't we need a conception of the best regime?
Oh God, no. I think that's one of the perversions of modern politics. I mean,
well, a city in speech. Plato tells us this.
Yes, I mean, well, modern political life wants justice without virtue, as T.S. Eliot put it in The Chorus of the Rock. And one way you get that is you treat political theory as the source for premises in practical syllogisms. Whereas for Plato, theory is a kind of illumination, right? It's the leavening of the mind. It doesn't actually provide, the ideal society in speech doesn't provide you with a template by which to govern. Well, I mean, I just think it's obvious to me that that Plato, yeah, I think it's very modern, it's very Cartesian to think of theory as something you can use. And I think one of the perversions in our political life is that we're paralyzed until we can be convinced that X course of action is based in some indubitable principle or will lead to some obviously better situation, where I think our political duty now is to try to nurture those things that we have as best we can, to bring out the best in them, of what's left of the family, our poly, our civil society, and religious life in America, to try to nurture it and renew it, while at the same time not squandering, you know, the genuine achievements of the post-war era, which were, I mean, we don't want to return of fascism. I don't happen to think it's a danger now. I think at this point the dangers are disillusion and liquid, everything becoming liquid, not some sort of intense consolidation around something. But nevertheless, I think, I'm very suspicious of that way of thinking, Pinkowski.
Yes, lead strength.
Thank you so much for your lecture. One of the debates going on the right end of the intellectual world is whether or not liberalism in general or the American founding in particular are the cause of current cultural maladies. And I'm thinking Patrick Deneen's book. But you're saying something, I think you're saying something different, and so I wanted to see if you could comment on what you think of that thesis and whether it has a relationship to your thesis.
I'm working on this project precisely to short-circuit the genealogies of modernity or genealogies of liberalism as the one key the one ring that rules them all. And it strikes me that the problems that we have are much more manageable than that. And our traditions are much healthier than Patrick allows. Because they're much more heterogeneous than he allows. Now, it is the case, I think, that the post-war era elevated a certain kind of theoretical liberalism, and someone like Rawls, who was clearly traumatized by the war, both the concentration camps and the atomic bombs. I mean, that clearly is at the root of his, I think, kind of flesh-eating liberal theory. So the answer is not to, the answer is not to, I don't know, rewrite our Constitution, but to put aside this, to have some recognition that we've inherited imperatives and priorities in civic life that are oriented towards problems we no longer have. In fact, the problems we have are stem from the over-application of those earlier imperatives. Right? I'm not an academic, so I can say outrageous things, and I'll do it right now. Racial discrimination is not the greatest problem facing our country. It is a problem, and it's an evil, and it's an injustice, but it's not the greatest problem. The greatest problem facing our country is that people who graduate from Princeton are no longer trusted by other people to run the country. And you cannot maintain a polity if there's not solidarity, unity between the leaders and the led. And the problem we have is we may not have a country in 20 years, at least not a functional one. Instead, we could have a kind of very rich platform for a global oligarchy that, here you have Amazon that just squeezed $5 or $6 billion out of these municipalities. And I just think, our civic life is potentially collapsing in the face of these gigantic global corporations. So again, that's not to say that racial discrimination is not evil and that we ought not to fight it. Of course we should. It's a question of priorities. So in that sense, I don't think Popper goes away or becomes not worth thinking about and reading about, but it's a question of what we as citizens, we have to wake up and say, we've inherited a way of analyzing the threat that is, again, it's worse than irrelevant. It actually impedes our ability to articulate what the problem is.
Go to the middle here. Yes, in the back.
Thanks, Rusty. I thought that was really helpful. I agree that theory is overrated. But during your talk, I was wondering whether you were keeping your own counsel about minimizing theory. But I'm not sure if that's the case or not. So could you explain a bit more about how you understand the conditions on the ground not being as perhaps threatening or as damaging as misguided open society? So let me give an example. The crisis of the family, or there's a condition on the ground. Somebody like Mary Eberstadt thinks that the crisis of the family works back to the crisis of religion.
Sure.
Or Augusto Del Noce, in his reflection on the book The Sexual Revolution, the praxis seems to affect the theoretical understanding. Are the conditions on the ground less important, or do they determine the understandings that are possible to us? And is it enough to reconfigure, as I think you're saying, the understanding without giving sufficient attention to the praxis?
Yeah, I guess I'm an American optimist, so I think we can turn this thing around, and part of it is, your question, if liberalism is, if the liberal tradition, I distinguish liberalism as a theory, and if the liberal tradition is at the root of our problems, then, where do I start? I'm an American. So how can I blow on the embers of our civic piety to try to encourage a renewal that we're all in this together if I think that one of the fundamental, our DNA is just screwed up. And the same thing with the family. And religion is a different case. I think in our tradition, we don't, statesmanship needs to be very cautious in its engagement with the question about religion. I think we should try to encourage the religious life of the American people carefully, so as not to embroil for reasons that the founders, fully recognize why it was such a perilous thing to do. So I think these are amenable to our efforts. You think I'm too optimistic, RJ?
I'm not sure if you're too optimistic. My worry is that your optimism is about a theoretical narration as opposed to dealing with the potential inability of that narration to take hold if the practice of family and so on.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So there's a kind of constituency for the Popperian. There's a lot of, once things are degraded and people are atomized, then they want a governing philosophy for atomized people. This kind of Tocqueville's, that's his anxiety in Democracy in America, is that, the democratic era will atomize people, and eventually they'll desire, the minute ministrations of the state. I don't have an answer, I think, to that. Am I evading your question, do you think, or?
Yeah. So I love reading John Milbank, and I worry you're being more like him.
What?
It's a nice re-narration, but is re-narration sufficient?
Oh, right. I agree. No, it's obviously not sufficient. I think what I want to do tonight is to convince you that many of the habits of mind that you have inherited about what it means to be a responsible leader in our society are tinctured in very contingent ways by the trauma of 1914 and 1945. And that trauma, for all kinds of understandable reasons, made the Western liberal tradition, it made it unbalanced in the direction of individualism and openness and also this kind of going small, the attempt to sort of drain as much as possible out of public life. That's all I can do, and now what we do with that once we confront concrete problems, maybe that's, Nathan, to your point, that maybe then we do need a stronger theoretical, we need to think about, okay, now Reno has freed me from my, woken me from my dogmatic slumbers, and now what do we do? And I don't really offer much there.
Tocqueville does. It's a call for a new political science. That's why he's writing Democracy in America.
Pardon?
Tocqueville asks questions. He writes Democracy in America to conceive the new political science.
Yeah, but it's pretty ad hoc, and it's, he makes ad hoc observations, leavened with kind of musing reflections. It's not a theory, Democracy in America. It's been theorized by scholars, that's our job.
All right, let's, Al Sears.
Thanks for the talk. The post-war consensus had a certain vision of international order that went with it. And I wonder how you see that playing out today. I'm thinking in particular of the way that post-Cold War Russia seems to be figured as this sort of evil enemy, whereas China is sort of pretty much neglected, even though it's a much clearer continuation of the totalitarian state of the past.
Well, I think the way that I play this out in a more extensive treatment that I give it and some other stuff I've written as a book that I'm working on, 1989 is really pivotal because the Cold War maintains a kind of consolidation of, so that it's the open society versus the closed society. And so the enemy other, always kind of consolidates and creates a border, if you will, around the open society. If you permit me this imagistic way of talking. And post-1989, that starts to fall away. And so then you really do get utopian dreams about kind of an open world. And I think that's done, I think that has been, that's been very, that kind of utopianism is very destructive, I think. That's not fair. It has led to lots of bad, I think, decisions and myopias. And then so because, at some point, you have to have borders, right? I mean, every country has to have borders. And so metaphorically or imagistically, every country has to have a sense of its own limits. And so, I think that there's a phenomenological reason in terms of just what it means to be a modern democratic state or a modern state, broadly understood, that naturally wants an enemy in order to reassure itself about its own borders, so to speak. I think Russia plays that role right now. I mean, it's an adversary, dangerous country, potential bad actor, but we've blown it up into something. I think it serves a kind of psycho-political role purpose in our public life.
Excuse me.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think on the whole, I really like the story. I like the move to kind of go small in some sense vis-a-vis the modernity critics by saying, no, this is just about a post-war consensus, and therefore you give us some hope of management and possible tending to our politics. But you talked mainly historically and politically. I wonder if I could ask a theological question, because it seems like a lot of the questions that you characterize as the big questions for our time that touch on sacred things about who we are and who our shared loves are, they have a long theological pedigree. And in some sense, this question about the open society could be re-narrated as a theological debate about Pauline Christianity and its ever-inclusive openness to the other. And are you a Donatist? And is that what you're trying to say, that we got it wrong, and that Galatians 3 Christianity, that is really liberal Protestantism, and we need to kind of have a reimagination, and Paul was wrong to seemingly suspend any theological interest in nations qua nations? And is this all about supersessionism and Christianity and its relation to Judaism?
So it's like, is Daniel Boyarin? Is Daniel Boyarin the proper interpreter of St. Paul? Kind of question. Yes, deep waters. See, my view is that I think yes, Christianity. It's not a coincidence that G.K. Chesterton that said that the vices of the modern age are Christian virtues gone mad. And so the Hayekian, Popperian impulse reflects that kind of imbalance. And the church has always struggled because there's no formula there. And Christianity has always struggled with marriage and family, ultimately plunking down for the Thomistic view that grace perfects and doesn't destroy nature, and so we're by nature familial, and we're by nature social or political animals, and so grace perfects that rather than destroying it. So that's the direction I would go, and so that I think I would oppose. I know that I've written against these what I think are unbalanced interpretations of Paul.
And are the national gods part of the order of creation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, my definition of them as gods is metaphorical, obviously, but they're shared loves. So, I mean, the strong gods are anything that evoke in us the ardor of love, and so truth in that sense is a god. And my family is a god. So there's something dangerous about talking that way, and I deliberately use that language to be provocative. But theologically, of course, they're not gods at all. They're orders of creation.
Ron.
Thanks, Rusty. I was interested in what you were saying about the sort of center-left, or maybe Popper himself, I might have knocked out that, right? In the 50s and 60s, this sort of critique of the conventional middle class is kind of moving away from it. Because that would seem to be sort of self-defeating for liberalism, right? Because the bourgeois man, the middle class, is sort of at the heart of the rise of liberal societies. So I'm wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little on that, if there's sort of tension in his thinking there, and maybe say something about where the center-left and center-right today, where the middle class fits in, and are they represented in any way by either side?
No, that's a great question. but it is very powerful if you look at, and it's very widespread, and it emerges out of establishment liberals in the 50s. David Reisman, the Lonely Crowd, White's organizational man, early 50s stuff. They're very worried about the closed society and the psychosocial consequences of this kind of encompassed world. Part of my change in thinking, or my growing awareness was, it was probably half a dozen years ago, maybe longer. I was in a used bookstore and I got a copy of Run, Rabbit, Run, John Updike, 1959. Made a big impact. And it's a very familiar book. It's a very familiar story about somebody who's being suffocated in his bourgeois norms, bourgeois life. And I remember, I know my parents were very affected by it, and they were big Updike fans and so on. And I read it. He's a wonderful writer. He's got such elegant prose. And I got distracted by some other book, and I never finished it. It just didn't hold my interest at all, because it just seems so cliched at this point. So we can't doubt but that the establishment center-left consensus was anti-middle class in that sense. And I would submit that since 1989, since the 1990s, the Republican Party has been anti-middle class also. So you have the creative class, innovators, and all that kind of stuff. It's really striking when you start to think about it, how much of our political rhetoric and our social cultural imagery began to refocus around the top 1 to 10% of society. What's the relation to liberalism? I think culturally, liberalism is always an elite phenomenon. Democracy, our founders wanted a liberal democracy, not a democracy, because the liberalism was what would restrain the demos. And so I think liberalism is always primarily something that elite people are anxious about and want to encourage. And in John Stuart Mill, people of genius need to have the freedom to engage in their experiments and living. And I think part of the crisis of, it's this crisis of trust between the leaders and the led. The many and the few have grown apart in our society, and that this poses a threat to, doesn't pose a threat to liberalism, but it does pose a threat to democracy. So.
This is good. So, in terms of economics, so you mentioned, I remember Bret Stephens, John Goldberg. I'm thinking for people who have much larger audiences, who are not, who haven't become critics of, say, Trump, who you started with at the beginning, there tends to be a much easier fusion of the old freedom economics rhetoric with solidarity rhetoric, with immigration, for example, which you brought up as a central point. And I think there's a lot of evidence that most people who support a more a narrower immigration policy also support sort of old style freedom, economic freedom policies, with some exceptions, protectionism being one. But that's always been an issue and a struggle in the free market. It doesn't necessarily mean you're not free market works on protectionism. So that being the case, libertarians have tried to argue that libertarianism is the naturally good politics that should take. Well, that hasn't really happened. But instead, what's happened is a sort of bifurcation where you have an alliance on the right, for the most part, because there's always a Bret Stevens's and John Wilbur's are going to write that, but for the most part, most people on the right are sort of fusing the old freedom rhetoric together with the solidarity rhetoric. And on the left, you have this odd fusion of a sort of materialistic rhetoric and a tribalistic rhetoric, which you described very well. So why is that happening? If your thesis holds correct, shouldn't there be a strong bifurcation on the right, where there's either a total split with substantial numbers on each side, which doesn't seem to be happening, or just, a rejection of one of the languages?
Well, I think the Wall Street Journal editorial page mounts a consistent battle against any backsliding on economic openness. I leave the question of freedom, I think, it's a hard word, but if we use openness, it's better. It's a better, more descriptive. The more open markets are, the less restrictive markets are, the better. So the Wall Street Journal editorial page has been consistently denouncing Trump's moderate protectionism or all the negotiation of the trade deals at every step. I don't think there's any. I can't identify any mainstream. I think Oren Cass, his article in American Interest a month ago, called The Working Hypothesis. He's a young guy. He was a policy advisor for Romney. And it's basically an argument for the need to shift from a, if you will, an entrepreneurial vision to a worker vision of economic policy. Which I thought was a really important publication. Didn't mention the word Trump, but it's really a roadmap for, I think, establishment conservatives to begin to adjust in the direction of solidarity. Because I think this is a matter of adjustment. It's not a matter of having a revolution. It's a matter of adjustment to actually say, well, wait a minute. We have this system, we have a free market system, and in this free market system, if the biggest problem is that the middling talented are being left behind, how do we rebalance towards the middling? And I do think there's a growing consensus. How are we going to do this without squandering the achievements of our system, et cetera, which I think is healthy. But not without a whole lot of resistance, it seems to me, on the part of, and my explanation for the resistance is because we've inherited priorities. I think we confuse priorities with principles. In 1980, did I vote for Ronald Reagan? I did vote for Ronald Reagan in 1980, and I certainly voted for him in 1984. And at that time, our economy needed to be opened up. And it's 2018, and I look at what's going on out there, and I think, wow, we need to have like a 5% tax on internet revenues of companies that make more than $1 billion of revenue. I mean, we really are in a situation where we could have whole counties in the United States where the only retail outlet is the gas and go at the interstate interchange. I don't see that as promoting the common good at all, and that requires using the power of the state to put some boundaries, build some borders, if you will, on the voracious appetite of the market. I mean, Catholic, in Rerum Novarum, one of the things that Leo XIII argued for is respecting the Sabbath, because, the industrial machine had a voracious appetite for labor and wanted to be running 24/7, and so some Sabbath restrictions are fitting, it seems to me. In a pluralistic society like ours, the Sabbath restrictions have to be tailored in a way that makes sense for the kind of country we are. And the similar is true for what we let the market, how much we let it transform our society. So is that satisfying?
Yeah, I wonder how much of it is new in the sense that for 20 years, the Wall Street Journal has also been making arguments about immigration, tariffs. It's like a redux of the Bush administration when they did impose steel tariffs, and they tried immigration reform, and it didn't work because most Republicans wouldn't go along with it. So I just wonder how representative it is, just because, okay, so the Wall Street Journal editorial board is writing this, or columnist A or columnist B or columnist C. I wonder if most people think in a sort of fusionist language already.
Well, a young friend of mine, he was a speechwriter for Kevin McCarthy, and I was meeting with him a couple of years ago, and he said, the congressman, he was in Silicon Valley, he's all talking about, innovation, our country, the future of our country depends on innovation, and he was just shaking his head. Yeah, that's very 1990s. So that's the guy who will be the new minority leader probably in the House who's still thinking in terms of how do we make our economy more dynamic. And I'm all in favor of a dynamic economy. We ought not to stop thinking about that. But it's a question of what the priority is. It seems to me we are in a time where our priority is how can we make the economy work for the middling talented, the high school educated American. Because if we fail at that, it's not likely we're going to be able to sustain the system, right? So Rawls' point, unless you can have a kind of, unless median IQ people can function independently as middle class people in America, I don't see how you sustain a democracy under the. That's an imperative, and if achieving that goal shaves 0.5% off the GDP, we should try to minimize whatever harm that does to GDP. But if it does a little bit of harm to GDP, I think you just have to say, well, this is what the priority is. And I think, again, we had priorities after the war. The priorities were to loosen up economically a quasi-command and control system. We had big industrial cartels with government guaranteed profits. Anybody old enough to have worked in the old corporate system knew how unnimble it was. And so we needed to open that up. But then we have people of a generation thinking we still need to do that. More. And you think, well, wait a minute, that's not the problem anymore.
I guess what I'm understanding is, so you've made the case to me very compellingly that the Wall Street Journal types have to adjust their thinking. That's pretty easy, I think, to convince. My question is the opposite side. Well, what about all the people who have made that adjustment or were always there on the solidarity side? Why should they make an adjustment in their thinking on economics? The Rush Limbaughs of the Republican Party, who have both types of rhetoric and fuse them, and have for years and years and still do. Why should they just, how's it going to make anything better to change the economic freedom emphasis? What's going to change that'll make our situation better?
Well, freedom is an American word, and it's our word. And we got to figure out how to redeem it. So I agree with you, Mitch. And I wrote a book, Resurrecting the Idea of a Christian Society, not a good title, sadly, because it's not really about that. The publisher imposed it on me. But I realized I had to address the question of freedom because it's the American thing, and I tried to make it to make that solidarity and freedom thing go together at the end. So I agree with you. So when I give talks, I often put them at odds because I want to punch people and wake them up, if you will. But I have confidence that we'll get there. But if you look at 2016, the Republican National Convention, Ted Cruz, Reaganism 4.0, his convention speech, he must have used the word freedom 100 times. Kind of this manic effort to resurrect Reagan. Trump's convention acceptance speech, if he mentioned the word twice, I would be surprised. And I thought, wow, something has changed in American politics. That you have a Republican candidate not running on freedom. And I think that's really the root of people's anxieties about Trump, is that by refusing the freedom motifs, he is rejecting, everything under the sun. Whereas I see it more as it's this kind of animal genius to recognize that the freedom language has become toxic in our time right now, because it's become an enemy of solidarity functionally, although not theoretically and finally.
Great. Well, it's after 6, so we'll have to call it quits. But please join me in thanking Steve.